This is a DIY ice cooler air conditioner. It is not a swamp cooler. This thing is completely portable. Today, I'm going to show you step by step how I made this thing, and we're going to see if it works. I'll put links to everything I'm using in the video today in the description below, and I'll show you how much it costs to build it. Here's a rough sketch of what we're going to do today. I'm going to take an ice cooler, a water pump, a radiator, and a fan. The pump is going to move cold water from the cooler up through the radiator and back down into the cooler. The fan is going to draw cold air across the radiator and through some ductwork. This whole system is going to be powered by 12 volt, and I'm going to use this cigarette lighter plug. One of the first things I'm going to do is cut a 4-inch hole into the lid so that I can install one of these two flanges. Now that I've got my hole drilled, I can see that I'd rather use this flange, so I need to make my hole just a little bit bigger. Next, I want a notch into the lid so that I can recess the radiator down into the lid. I'll just run my screws down and attach the radiator to the lid. I'd like to have my flange sitting directly on my radiator, so I'm going to have to cut some of this flange off to make up for the gap. And now I'll level it off with the belt sander. So after I cut my flange, I ended up cutting it down to 7/16, which made my fit almost perfect. Now that I have my radiator and flange installed, I need to provide a way for air to get inside of the cooler. That's where these 3-inch floor drain caps come in. I'm going to install these right there. Next, I want to install my water line and water pump. 5/16 inside diameter is going to work perfect for the radiator, but it's a little too small to go onto my water pump. To solve this problem, I'm just going to heat up this tubing and slide it over top of the fitting. To protect the pump from any debris that might be in the ice, I'm going to use this filter that's made for a swamp cooler. I'm just going to cut a piece and I'm going to zip tie it over top of the pump. That way, it's protected. When I have the lid closed, I want to make sure that my pump is not laying down and that it's just sitting right on the bottom. So when I cut my tubing, I made sure that I cut it so that that could happen. Now I'll install my tubing that's going to return the water to the cooler. And I'll just zip tie it to the other tubing. To make sure everything stays out of the way and off to the side when the door opens and closes, I'm going to use one of these conduit clamps and stainless steel screws. I'm going to make sure I keep this above my water line. Next, I've drilled a 1/4-inch hole so that I can get the power feed up to the controls. For controls for our project today, I'm going to be using this 30 amp pulse width modulator. This is basically a dimmer switch. This is going to allow me to turn the fan up or down, and I can conserve power, and depending on where I'm using this thing, I'll be able to control the fan speed. To install my pulse width modulator, here's the diagram that I'm going to use. I have my fan and my pump. Both the fan and the pump are going to go to the motor side of the pulse width modulator. Negative to negative and positive to positive. And then on the power side of the pulse width modulator, we'll just go to the battery. This will allow the speed control to control both the fan and the pump. I've got the fan and the pump hooked up to the motor side of the pulse width modulator, and I have the power supply hooked up to my jumper box. And when I turn it on, the fan is adjustable and the pump is adjustable. The more fan, the more water. Now that I've proved the concept works, I'll install the controls on top of the cooler lid. With the control box mounted, next I'll hook up my ductwork for my fan. Now I'll attach the fan to the lid. To glue my vents into place into the lid, I used great stuff. It worked awesome. I just put some around there inside the lid and pushed them into it. I even used some of this to fill the gaps around my radiator. Now I'll hook up the power cord to the switch, and then we'll hook up the fan and the pump. Now I'll connect the positive from the fan and the positive from the pump. Then I'll connect the negative from the fan to the negative from the pump. Let's hook it up to a power supply and see if we have power. All right, the light's on in there. Now that I know that it's wired correctly, let's test it out and see how cold it gets. To complete my build, I cut a 1-inch piece of foam. This is going to keep the air off of the ice as it's cycling through the system. This thing was pretty easy to cut. I made a template out of paper, and then I just traced a pattern, and then I cut it out with my hot wire styrofoam cutter. This is a pretty important part of the build. This creates an air chamber at the top of the cooler. This will allow air to cycle through the intake and then out through the blower. My plan here is to turn this thing on. I'm going to let it run for 10 minutes, and then we're going to see how cold it gets. Okay, the timer just went off, and it's been about 10 minutes. Here in my garage, it's about 85 degrees. The blower is set on about 7. It can go up to 10. It can go lower. So I'm gonna leave it right about 7. And let's see how cold the air is coming out of the blower. I'm gonna use my laser. We'll take a few different readings. 64 to 64, 70, 65, 63, 65. I'm going to call it 65. So 65 is about the air temperature coming out of this thing. Building an ice cooler air conditioner is simple and affordable. I'm working on a video where I'm testing this thing to see just how well it performs. When I'm finished with that video, I'll put a link to it right here. Until then, check out this video for how to paint camouflage. Just like I did on this project table, this thing turned out pretty awesome. I'm glad you watched, and I hope you'll watch again.
Did someone say camouflage?